I'll repeat myself for those of you that weren't with us last week. We're in the midst of a worship series called Joy, the Flip Side of Justice, in which we are listening to some of the harder words of the prophets. And I admitted last week, and I'll say it again each week, that standing there and reading those words from Isaiah, it makes me feel squirmy on the inside. Reading those words of judgment is not something we're particularly accustomed to in worship. Now, something interesting about this week's selection, that text from Isaiah 5 about the vineyard, is that it plays on another genre that we're probably not very familiar with, because it's another genre of scripture that doesn't get read aloud in worship very much. Isaiah uses the genre of a love song that we might find in Song of Solomon. But you'll find that even if you are a lifelong attender of church, you probably have not heard Song of Solomon read in worship very often, because there's some interesting stuff in there that's great to study, and it has lots of value, but it's hard to unpack in the worship service, and sometimes the wording in Song of Solomon gets rather personal and not as G-rated as we like to keep the scriptures that we use in worship. But Isaiah plays on them in the context of this particular text. In fact, one of the commentators that I was reading as I was trying to understand some of what's happening in this text says that she imagines that they're at a feast, perhaps like a wedding feast, and somebody accidentally passes the mic to Uncle Isaiah. You know, crazy Uncle Isaiah, who's known for saying weird things at public gatherings. And Uncle Isaiah launches into what sounds like a love song until it doesn't anymore. And as I was reading her sort of description of how she imagined this unfolding, what came to mind is a song from a musical that's kind of a favorite at our house. If you have met my sons, you know that they're obsessed with Hamilton, and have been for about 2 years. And one of the things that happens in the musical Hamilton is that partway through, fairly early in the first act, we hear from King George III, who of course you know is the monarch who received the Declaration of Independence from our revolutionaries during what led up to the Revolutionary War. And King George sings his response to this declaration from the colony here. And they did an interesting thing. Most of Hamilton is rapped or is in hip-hop style, except for when King George sings. And the things that King George sings sound like something you might have heard the Beatles sing. And it's sort of this poppy 60s kind of love song, except for that it's not. As King George is singing about his desire to hang on to the colonies and to all that they have to offer, he's singing it in this very light, very loving sort of way, and then you get to one of the choruses and he sings, "I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love." Da 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 da. And then the next time around, when he sings, "I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love." And again, da 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 da. And it just, your brain just kind of, it works because your brain is so freaking out, kind of trying to rectify the words that are being sung with the style they're being sung in. And that's a little bit of what I imagine happening with Isaiah's prophecy, except some key differences. You see, in the musical Hamilton, King George III is singing from the perspective of greed and the desire for power, particularly because it's written from the American perspective. But we remember that King George's desire to hang on to the colonies is not driven by love, but instead by a desire, by a lust for what the Americas could produce, what those colonies were able to produce, for the power that came with having a presence on the continent that was being explored and claimed by nations all over Europe, that the British Empire wanted and needed that place on what was happening in the expanding world. And so all of that is driving King George's song, that desire to keep military and economic force in the world, to continue to build up power, to build up force, to build up greed. And Isaiah's song is the opposite. Isaiah's song is one of God who has given and given and given, and finds that those to whom he gives are taking and taking and taking, and continuing to gather into themselves economic power, power over one another, that injustice is taking over this vineyard. And there's some other interesting word placings here with the Hebrew particular words that get chosen. In fact, the reference to the hill doesn't use the word that's often used for hill, but instead uses a word that refers to horn. And that brings with us, you may know that around Thanksgiving time, we see lots of images of the horn of plenty, the cornucopia, and that imagery actually dates all the way back into ancient Israel and into the ancient world, and so that sense of plenty and bounty is bound up in that word. You also may remember from your Sunday school days, or have heard the story or seen it played on television and in popular culture, that remember King David, sort of the epitome of the height of Israel's story, is anointed as a child by a prophet carrying a horn of oil. And so Isaiah plays on all of this imagery of the richness of the horn and the oil and all of the things that God has done. He gives us a really active picture of God's cultivation of the promise for Israel, that we get this image of somebody going out and choosing the most fertile ground that can be found, choosing the best vines that can be found, of planting them just right, of clearing away all the stones, of doing everything that's needed for the vines to succeed, putting up a wall to keep people and animals out, of tending and caring for the vines, of putting up a watchtower in the middle so that it can be guarded and kept at all times, of creating a vat with the anticipation of the fruit that the vines will bear, and God's disappointment, God's heartbrokenness, that instead of the good and sweet grapes that God is anticipating, that the vineyard produces wild grapes, or we might say sour grapes. The kind of grapes you don't want anything to do with the wine that could be made from those. And the condemnation is harsh. But it's not just about God's wrath and God's anger at the injustice and at the greed and at the seeking of power and at the obliviousness to the needs of others that God is watching unfold among God's people. It's also about God's heartbreak. I had the opportunity a couple of years ago to be a part of something called The Summit. It's a week-long residential camp for juniors and seniors in high school to discover vocation and to dive deep into their faith, particularly in preparation for launching into college and adulthood. And they have, each year they have scholars and residents who come in and who teach Bible classes and who preach at their worship services. And I was sitting in on one of the Bible classes with a resident Bible scholar who had come up from a college in Alabama. And she said something that I think I have always known, but I had never heard it sort of stated boldly, and that's that these statements of condemnation, these calls to justice, are not just for the oppressed, but also for the good of the oppressor. That justice is good news for both. Because oppression is the kind of thing that takes over. That when we begin to not worry about trampling people in order to build up worldly goods, when we stop worrying about trampling people in order to build up power and security for ourselves, when we stop worrying about who we're trampling in order to gain fame or notoriety for ourselves, when we begin to do those things, we create a world in which we are destined to devour our very selves, to be eaten up by a hunger that can never be satisfied, to be taken over by desires that will never be fulfilled. And so God's condemnation, God's call back to righteousness, God's call back to justice is a call that ought to be viewed as good news for all, for those in power and for those who are powerless, for those on both ends of the economic spectrum, for those who are famous and well-known and those who feel like nobody. And then we get to Hebrews. And the author of Hebrews, I love, when I read this text, I can almost not slow myself down enough to say the words, because you get this sense of the pace at which the author is thinking of all of the people who have gone before, who have set the example, who have lived lives of faithfulness and whose lives reflect God's faithfulness, even when they're not that faithful. Because if you really look at that list, not everybody in that list lived perfect lives. David made a lot of big mistakes, and God's faithfulness was still with him. And the author gets so excited, and then we get into some of the folks that we may not even know their names, but whose stories are such that the author can just allude to them, and the original readers knew. Because the letter to the Hebrews is written to a people who know what difficulty and persecution look like, who have watched the generations before them literally be put to death for their faith, be tortured and tormented for their faith. And instead of this being a discouragement, the author offers this as a way to look for support and strength when things are difficult. I find it phenomenal that in my journey of faith, I have never encountered a struggle or a difficulty or a turning point in my faith that somebody else before me has never experienced. And so we find use for folks who have lived 100 or 200 or 400 years before us. We find use for the words of those who were the earliest Christians. We read Augustine and John Chrysostom and Teresa of Avila and Julian of Norwich, and it's amazing to me how many people right now find Julian of Norwich, for example, her words so encouraging that you can find them on coffee mugs and tote bags and on people's tattoos and t-shirts, because those are words that we still need to hear in our faith today, that all will be well and all will be well and all manner of things will be well. Because sometimes in our lives and in our faith stories, it's hard to hang on to that. And the author of Hebrews invites us to know those people's stories, to hear the context of their struggles as well as their victories, in order to receive encouragement in our own journey of faith. In fact, actually, he doesn't say journey of faith, he says the race, right? There's this sense of urgency and difficulty implied in using that terminology. That we use not only the cloud of witnesses, but also the one who goes before us, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith, as a way of talking about who Jesus was. And we remember Jesus as one who sought justice first, who viewed people with eyes of compassion, who lived a life of righteousness, who saw the holiness of tending to God's people over the holiness of keeping strict rules. The Jesus who was willing to not only die, but die in the most shameful way to the imagination of his contemporaries, in order to allow something better to be offered to all of us. the joy of resurrection, and the hope of eternal life. So the good news becomes that following in the example of Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, we are invited by Isaiah's words, not into shame and self-doubt and guilt and hatred of ourselves, but into a turning that allows us to live lives that will bear good fruit. That our lives bear the kind of fruit that allow others to taste God's goodness. That when we turn to lives of justice, when we turn to lives of righteousness, when we turn to lives living in community with one another in the way that God is calling and working for, and the kind of relationship with God and with one another that God strives for, then we don't just get to tell the good news, we get to be the good news. We get to offer others a taste of the sweetness of life in relationship with God. And we get to point others to Jesus, whose life and death and resurrection is the pinnacle of all hope, the good news and the joy of our lives. Thanks be to God. Amen.